Good afternoon. I'm Keith Luce with the National Committee on North Korea. I'm pleased today to welcome you to an event co-sponsored by NCNK and the World Affairs Council of San Francisco. This event is going to basically take a compass reading of the Party Congress in North Korea. And we are especially delighted that moderating today is Philip Yun. Philip is the president and CEO of World Affairs San Francisco. Philip previously served as the executive director and chief operating officer of the Plowshares Fund. He's been a vice president of the Asia Foundation, and he served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs during 1994 to 2001, and was a key person in the so-called Perry process, which many of you will either recall or know about. So Philip, thank you so much for being with us and for taking charge of today's event.
Great. Thank you, Keith. Happy New Year to everybody. Hope all is well. I'd like to extend my welcome to you all, and I hope that you and your loved ones are well and staying safe. World Affairs is just really pleased to partner with NCNK on this very timely program. NCNK is a organization that is very close to my heart. And, Keith, I just wanted to thank you again for all that you've been doing. Just to make sure that those of you who are popping in, you're joining us now for discussion on North Korea's just concluded 8th Party Congress. And today's program features two very distinguished panelists. I'm really delighted that we were able to pull this together. The first person I want to introduce is Robert Carlin, who's the non-resident fellow at Stimson Center. And I have to say, he's just one of my favorite people. I've known Bob for a very, very long time. I have to say, to the extent that my knowledge of North Korea has been enhanced by him so greatly. He's been a colleague, a mentor, and a great friend. And as you well all know, he's a well-known North Korea analyst. He'd been at the CIA, then at State, and then at Stanford, and now at Stimson. So Bob, it's just great to have you with us. Our next panelist is Sarah Vogler, who I have not met before. She's a CNA's expert on adversary analysis and a particular focus on North Korea. And her recent topics have included North Korea decision-making, its command and control, as well as, just sort of general US security policy analyst in Northeast Asia. And I've read a few of her writings, just top notch. And I'm just so great to have the opportunity to have met you and to hear your perspective on what's going on. So welcome to you both. So before we start, we're going to dive into it. Just a couple of housekeeping measures for all of you. We're going to have a 30-minute conversation among Bob, myself, and Sarah. We're going to open it up for about 20 minutes of questions. We're going to end in about 55 minutes. Right now, you're all on mute. If you do have a question, please enter it. I believe, Sarah, it's in the chat box. Is that right? Or there should be a Q&A thing here as I look at the piece here of what we've got available, and send your questions on. You're on mute, and we'll locate those, and then we'll unmute you as we move forward. And then finally, just as a reminder for all of you, this is being recorded, okay? So it's being preserved for posterity. It's going to be on our website at World Affairs as well. So just wanted to let everyone know that who's listening. So let's get started. Let's do some quick context setting right now. So Bob, let's start off with you. Can you kind of give us a recap of where US and South Korea are with North Korea?
Phil, I'm so happy to be working with you again after all these years. When we started, you were a puppy dog, and now you are a serious, no, you are a really serious player in all of this, and I'm just an old dog, so I'll do what I can to add my thoughts on this. I'm not going to talk about South Korea, if that's all right.
That's fine.
They know what they're up to. Where we are, we have chickens coming home to roost, it seems to me, vis-a-vis North Korea. The last time we were in a good place with North Korea, in my view, was in probably November 2000. Things have not been going well since then. At the end of the Obama administration, they were in very bad shape. At the end of the Trump administration, the only good thing is that we had a summit which resulted in a communique, a Singapore joint communique, and that might still provide us with a basis for moving ahead at some point. And we'll get into that, I think, a little bit later in our discussion. Otherwise, we are completely isolated from the North Koreans, as they are from us. The pandemic has made things multiple times worse. We also have laws in this country which make it very difficult for American citizens to contact or deal with North Koreans, even if there weren't a pandemic. So it's a good question about who's isolated from whom and who is able to read the signals from the other side through a very dark, foggy glass.
Okay, great. So let's, there are a lot of things that you sort of laid out, and I would invite the audience to start, if they want to pull on some of those threads, let us know, and we'll try to integrate those as we have our conversation here. But let's go to the, what was advertised here in terms of the Party Congress. But first, before we go into those and the specific outcomes and talk about what the potential implications are, Sarah, why don't we just start off with a bigger picture thing? Why do we care about the North Korea's Party Congress? Why is it significant?
Thanks so much, and thank you. It's an honor to be here today on this panel with Robert Carlin, Philip Yun. Thank you to NCNK and to the World Affairs Council for inviting me. Yeah, it's a great question. Eighth Party Congress. Who does it resonate for? For those of us who watch in North Korea, it's a huge event. North Korea is often described as the hardest of hard targets. It's very difficult to know what's going on. An Eighth Party Congress is an opportunity for the regime to come and review past policy and set the agenda for the years ahead. It really is a great lens into what's going on with regime dynamics, where the leader Kim Jong Un sees his priorities and how he's making changes within the regime to try to address those priorities and set the course. So it's really, this is the second Party Congress under Kim Jong Un's rule. The one prior to the Seventh Party Congress in 2016, it had been 36 years since the last Party Congress. So it's interesting, I think, to see that these events are going to start happening potentially with some regularity or predictability in North Korea again.
Okay, great. So we can, again, you as well, through a lot of different things that we can pull on, but let me just sort of start with the big picture, which is sort of the big headline for everybody who's here starting out. Bob, what was for you your single biggest takeaway from the events of this Party Congress?
Actually, it was the continued emphasis on what we would call economic reform. The North Koreans wouldn't use that term, but I think we can. This is something that Kim Jong Un started as soon as he took power. It was a significant theme in the last Party Congress, and he has carried it forward as far as we can tell in this Party Congress. And I want to make a point here. We only have a sliver of what went on at this Congress. They gave us a full text in 2016, which was about 140 pages. This time we only have maybe 35, 40 pages of the work report on the Congress. And so we have to be very careful in the conclusions we draw. So they all have to be tentative, and we have to keep watching as as new information comes in, to see how it fits and whether it tracks with what we initially thought or whether we have to revise it. So everybody has to be careful what they're saying. Nevertheless, on this question of reform, I think it's probably the most important in the long term for understanding what's going to be going on in North Korea over the next 5 years.
So Sarah, I'm wondering, is that for you the single biggest takeaway? Is there something else that struck you as something that we should be, our audience should be aware of, and why is that the case?
I definitely agree that this concept of continuance of what Kim Jong Un has been doing, what he set in motion since the very earliest days of his rule, that he's sticking to that. That's definitely, and as I sort of alluded in my previous answer, the fact that this is happening again 5 years, that he's working to normalize the state and state institutions, that he's rebuilding these bodies that had really kind of gone by the wayside during the Kim Jong-il period. I think for me in 2016, that party Congress, that event was so much about thoroughly installing Kim Jong-un as the ruler of North Korea. Yes, he'd been in power since his father's death in 2011, no one disputes that, but the early years of his rule were really focused on consolidating his power over the wider regime and setting his priorities, and he's continued to do that up until now. And I think, as time kind of makes inevitable, we're seeing that the generational turnover, the older hardline officials are now moving out either because of age or they've been removed. That's not to say there aren't still hardliners in official positions of power and who have been elevated, but we're now seeing officials around him that, the bulk of the ascendancy within their careers has been during the Kim Jong-un period. So I think the power consolidation process kind of came to not an official end in 2016, but we're just kind of seeing him, continue to build on the foundations of his rule.
Okay, great. Let's, again, Sarah, you mentioned this. I mean, if we step back a little bit, North Korea held its 7th Party Congress in May 2016, as you said, after a 36-year hiatus, right? I mean, it's really interesting because when, I think it was almost 10 years ago when I was a fellowship at Stanford, there was a fellow colleague, there was a colleague of mine who made it their job to study leadership and was waiting for the next party Congress to happen, and it hadn't happened in like 20 years, and she was sort of like waiting for Godot for something to happen, and then 10 years later it actually does. So why do you think, you alluded to this, but let's talk about why is North Korea suddenly doing this right now? The 8th one, a little less than, it's less than 5 years, and should we read anything into this format in your mind?
I kind of see it for 2 potential explanations, some which may be, there may be bits of truth in both. I would say, it is very close to the 5-year mark. January 2021, we're a couple of months earlier than when we would have expected to see if they had stuck with the 5-year plan. But I think just with the year that North Korea had in 2020, the fact that there's been no real movement on the diplomatic front since 2018, I think that this, and the fact that North Korea knew that come January 2021, there would be either a new US administration or the Trump administration would be starting its 2nd term. So either way, it kind of presented an opportunity to reset or reassert, as the case may be, case could have been, North Korea's policy vis-a-vis the United States. I think that there's, and also the fact that in South Korea, the Moon administration has about 1 year left. So if North Korea is going to try to get anywhere with the stalled diplomatic relations, they may have to start kind of working on that now. But again, I think that that Kim hasn't had major policy success since the 2018 as a result of the charm offensive. He may be trying to see how he can reapproach US-North Korean relations.
Okay, and then Bob, if we look at, let's just start back with the Seventh Party Congress held in 2016. So in retrospect, and I guess this alludes to the larger question about why or how important, this is. I mean, we know that there are some people who absolutely dismiss what happens when they're talking. I mean, when they're looking at North Korea, they dismiss what, communiques or what's said in the newspapers or party, announcements. Some people treated the party Congress as just sort of perfunctory and really is not an indicator. So when you look at what happened in the party Congress, in 2016, in retrospect, how relevant do you think that was in terms of impact? And did it turn out to be that the headlines and the things that we read into it actually was an indicator of what was going to happen? Or was it something or not, or somewhere in between?
I look back at the analysis that we did actually right after the Sixth Party Congress. I want to just for the record note that I was around for the Sixth Party Congress. So I can't find my analysis from that. But anyway, for the seventh, I actually think that the breakthrough in diplomacy that we got in 2018 is pretty directly related to what happened in the Party Congress. And again, it's the economic foundation. In the Seventh Party Congress, as far as I was concerned, Kim tipped the balance from equal military economic attention to the economic. That doesn't mean they stopped building weapons or anything, but internally, the sort of the gravity of the policy was supposed to be moving towards the economy. A month after the Party Congress, there was a very high level statement out of Pyongyang having to do with negotiations with the United States. So those two things came together very soon thereafter. When Kim started moving to up his weapons program, and then I use the term pivot, a lot of people don't use it, but pivoted very quickly to sending out signals that he was near the end of the buildup and was moving toward negotiations. I would argue that a lot of this was put in place, at least in theory, at the Party Congress, and that's why this Party Congress is so important. People have to read it not in terms of what's going to happen tomorrow or even next week. This is a long-term blueprint for North Korea, and the fact that, for example, Kim, or the work report on the Congress, suggested very strongly that the Singapore Declaration remains a basis for moving toward a new relationship with the United States. That's very important. It doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but it's something that's out there that the North Koreans could be aiming for, and we have to keep our eyes on that.
So Sarah, let's follow up on that. So you, obviously you look at decision making, you look at strategic planning. We have the Congress, the Seventh Party Congress. I mean, do you agree that this is really a strategic plan? Is that how you're looking at it, or do you take a different? Is there a different take from you as to party congresses in general?
I like the term blueprint, or at least a very a general guide where priorities are laid down. It's one of the reasons why the appointments and things at these party congresses are interesting, because by the nature of who is selected to fill what role, you can kind of get a better sense of how the kind of broad guidelines are going to actually potentially be put into enactment. I think that there's I think that, and as a point I've made before, I think that in terms of the Seventh Party Congress and where North Korea was at the time. They were in the midst of their testing cycle with their nuclear weapons and their missiles. You know, very much, you know, the Byunjin policy line was still something that you heard about all the time. North Korea, Kim, you know, the two pillars of his legitimacy to be ruler are, you know, progress on the nuclear front, on the weapons front, and national security and the economy. He couldn't, you know, he couldn't abandon the nuclear testing before it could have demonstrated that they were generally usable weapons that could be used theoretically to act as some sort of deterrence. The problem that Kim was facing at the time was that testing would bring stronger sanctions, stronger condemnation from the international community, which would complicate his goals of improving the economy. So Kim's balancing act in 2016, he was still very much in that balancing act phase. And then once you got towards late 2017, he had proven the weapons capability to a point where it was, you know, there were other factors involved at the time, but that the switch over to diplomacy, charm campaign, he had some of the political maneuver space to be able to do that.
Okay. And then, so Sarah, let's stick with you for a second. So let's go to the Eighth Party Congress. And, you know, and you're the one who alluded to this about it being a very challenging time. You know, you've got, you know, the border with China has been closed for, you know, for a year, you know, mostly to trade and it's mainly because of Pyongyang's approach with respect to COVID-19. I mean, they have shut everything down given, you know, their lack of infrastructure to handle any kind of large scale outbreak. And that comes on top of several years of intensified sanctions. Kim Jong Un admitted that the 5-year plan, which was kind of, you know, it was very unusual that that 5-year plan had failed. And so let's dig in a little bit on the economic policy going forward. And, you know, how does Kim Jong Un plan to get out of the economic situation that he's in? Was there anything related to that at all?
You know, I think, Bob, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah.
Because I know I would be interested to hear your thoughts on the economic policy and market reforms, because you had begun to talk about that.
Yeah, Bob, maybe that's the better question for you. My apologies. Yeah.
I think you're on.
Yeah. Okay, I think I did.
Sorry.
Again, if we look very carefully at Kim's central reform pillar, which is what they call socialist management, which doesn't mean much to us sort of as a naked term. Even when they spell it out, they call it the socialist system of responsible business management, which also hardly means very much. But if you read everything that's said in the journals, in the North Korean journals, economic journal, and elsewhere about what this means, it means pushing decision-making down to enterprise level. Having managers empowered to make decisions, to buy raw materials, to apportion labor, perhaps, and then sell their products. If they go over, if they make more than the plan calls for, to sell that stuff or use it as they see fit. This worked. I was in North Korea in 2017, and you could see the positive effect of this energy that Kim had, in effect, had unleashed in the population. I think obviously he thinks that's still something that works. It's sort of capturing the greed is good idea. Have people produce and work when they know that they get the benefit from it. The problem is, for him, it's somehow putting guardrails on that. You can't let it go too far if you're in Pyongyang. So you have to channel that energy, you have to motivate people, and you have to face the problem that you have right now I don't think I'm sure it's serious. I was in North Korea 25 years ago in the middle of the famine. That was serious. That was a very serious time. I don't think they're anywhere near that right now. They're very resilient. They know how to work with shortages. So I think they have enough in reserve in terms of resources and human capital that they'll be able to get through this.
So Bob, we were together when we flew into Pyongyang, and we saw the devastation. I mean, there was no vegetation. People were eating I mean, it was just awful what it was like in North Korea during the winter. Skeptics will say, North Korea has said it was going to do a reform before. I mean, Kim Jong Un talked about that in the early 2000s, and everyone was talking. But in response to those people, you feel like this call for economic reform is actually getting traction?
I do. I feel a little bit more confident if we were able to go back in and see things on the ground. The
Right.
people who think that things are so terrible also don't have any on the ground experience. And so we're all drawing our conclusions from either our preconceived notions or some of our past experience. So we've got to wait and see. I don't look at these export-import figures as overwhelmingly important. I'll leave it there. I reserve judgment on this sort of thing.
Okay. All right, Sarah, we've seen some changes in North Korea's leadership and institutional structures announced in this party Congress. Kim Jong Un gained a new title of Secretary General of the Korean Workers' Party, a title that was previously given, I guess, in eternity to his father. What should we make of these changes?
It's kind of like we've been talking about. The party is kind of being returned to the center. Kim has consolidated his power, and he's rewiring regime dynamics to suit his priorities and his need. With the removal of the Executive Policy Bureau and with the return of the with the Secretariat, means that there's a general secretary position. Kim Jong-il still has a couple of other eternal titles, the chairman of the NDC. The NDC doesn't exist anymore, but he's still the chairman of it. There's some that suggest that this shift could be seen in North Korean, by the North Koreans as some sort of blasphemy. You're taking away the title of eternal secretary from the dear leader, and is that an overstep on Kim's part? I think that there's a practical reason for doing that. That I think Kim it's a signal to me that Kim's feels comfortable enough to make a move like that. Could also suggest that there's not less domestic love lost for the memory of Kim Jong-il. But I think that there's a symbolism piece to this, but it's also mixed with practical party organization structure in C2.
Okay, and then Sarah, let's talk about Kim Yo-jong, who's Kim Jong-un's sister. Her star, she kind of came out, she was very quiet, and then suddenly she came out over the last few years, and then her star was suddenly seemed to be going, way up. And then, there was something that went on over the summer, and then apparently somehow got a demotion. And, but, at the same time, she was quoted, I guess, as saying that she called the South Korean government a truly weird group. So, again, understanding that this is all sort of, no one knows for sure. What's your make of her role, her influence? Is it temporary? When you hear about all this and you think about this, what are the different things that go in your mind?
always seen the role of Kim Yo-jong in parallel to that of Kim Jong-un's aunt, Kim Kyung-hee. She was a confidant of Kim Jong-il. She was a guardian of Kim family equities. Her real power really was behind the scenes, and in her influence and her confidence with her brother. I see a lot of that with the relationship between Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong. I also think that there's that it's her demotion, if we want to call it that, is more of a signal of the fact that given her role as kind of head of North-South relations and kind of being North Korea's face of its South Korea policy, may indicate that South Korea policy is going to take a bit of a backseat. And I think that's evident with some of the other changes that we saw with the foreign ministry. There were demotion, Ri Yong-ho to Sun-hui. Those are all officials that were linked to North Korea's diplomatic strategy from the 2018 to 2020 period, and they've all kind of either been demoted, reshuffled around, and so I think part of what we can see in Kim Yo-jong's demotion is in keeping with that. That being said, I think that she likely still has some power. I attribute it more to the rigidity of North Korean politics, and she still has real power in the fact that she was able to make that speech at the end of the party Congress. So I don't think, but I also think that potentially there is, just given in the past year with all the debate about Kim Jong-un's health, the status of his leader, it was in the press everywhere, it was all but a foregone conclusion that Kim Yo-jong would be the one to succeed him. And my mind goes back to, I think it was early summer, right after the demolition of the Joint Liaison Office, and Kim Yo-jong gave a very powerful, very fiery speech. But then almost immediately thereafter, that the tenets that she spoke of in that speech were almost immediately countermanded by Kim Jong-un. It seemed to be a way of, giving her a platform, but also sort of keeping her in her place. It's a way of Kim Jong-un reinforcing the fact that when it comes to the Kim family and when it comes to the leadership of North Korea, you may speculate all you want about the growing role or influence or what's going to happen in terms of continuation of the Kim family. But for right now, I am the leader.
Okay, great. Just a reminder to folks, we are taking questions and we'll figure out how we move forward on that. So Bob, let's, in his party Congress speech, Kim Jong-un pledged to build a host of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. A lot of press was given to that. They were talking about tactical nuclear weapons, hypersonic glide vehicles, nuclear powered submarines, the whole thing, right? And he also said, whoever takes power in the United States, its entity, and the real intent, and its entity and the real intention of its policy towards toward the DPRK would never change. So, what are the prospects that Pyongyang would be willing to sit down with the Biden administration to put real constraints on its nuclear program? Or do you think he's just dead set on expanding, or is it posturing?
Yes, he actually asked two questions. What's the likelihood it would sit down with the Biden administration? And then you said, and put constraints on. We have a phrase we like to use all the time in this country: peace through strength, right? The North Koreans are using that as well. That's the argument that they're using for building up their programs. It's whether or not it's just rhetorical. It's a fact that they think that by being strong, they can keep the United States and everybody else at bay. There was a time when we convinced them that the United States, you'll remember this very well, in 1999, 2000, that they could deal with the United States without always having to be waving a saber around. Are we ever going to get back to that point? The more we wait, the worse it gets. That's something that does not seem to compute with a lot of people. Those people who thought the Singapore Declaration was a bad idea and that no deal was better than a bad deal in Hanoi are now stuck with the fact that Kim has a super large ICBM, has all these new short-range missiles. So it's going to get worse if somebody doesn't step in and say, okay, let's sit down and see if they're prepared to talk. At the Congress, by suggesting Singapore was still a platform, I think they left that door open. How ready they are to move at the moment, I don't know. We'll only find out if we probe it and if we're very careful in our rhetoric, not to ourselves nudge the door closed with our own feet.
So just to point out that, you know, North Korea has the capability and continues as far as we know to produce, you know, more fissile material on an ongoing basis. And that's just not a good thing for it to be sitting out there, for them to be doing that. So Sarah, you know, let's switch gears really quickly and then we'll wrap our session up. You know, South Korea. So in his New Year's speech, South Korean President Moon Jae-in said that he would sit down anytime, anywhere with North Korea. And based on what we saw at the Party Congress, what do you think are the prospects of that happening?
The challenge that South Korea faces is that, you know, they are, you know, as we saw over the course of the last 2 years, South Korea is really kind of hamstrung at doing much that will get the North Koreans' attention by sanctions and by, you know, the U.S. South Korea dynamic. So a couple things have to fall into place. There has to be the ability for South Korea to maneuver, because right now there's not much that they can offer that will get the North Koreans very interested. I think Moon was sincere and in being kind of a conduit between the U.S. and North Korea, but he wasn't able to get convince Washington or convince the Trump administration to get any kind of movement on sanctions. And so when that ended up falling through, it really became Kim Jong Un saw that he had, you know, less need to engage directly with South Korea. I think right now, especially with what could be on offer, you know, humanitarian aid, those kinds of things, those are kind of nice to have, but they're not going to really convince North Korea to do anything major that would set the scene. And so what'll be interesting going forward is, you know, the Biden administration has talked a lot about reinvigorating the alliance with South Korea, but to what end? You know, if it's going to be towards taking, you know, putting the pressure back on North Korea, then I don't think the North Koreans will see much utility in meeting with the South Koreans anytime soon. And it also depends on how things go in terms of Moon's last year in office.
Okay, I've got one last question before we start, when we go back to the audience questions, which are fantastic, and I see a lot of old friends there as well. So these are kind of wrapped together. I mean, you know, one question that I thought about was, you know, how do you think North Korea interprets the current turmoil in the United States? And realistically, I think that applies to a question that I think a lot of us are thinking right now. And this is very operational. Is North Korea going to shoot another long-range missile? Will they do another nuclear test or do something provocative on this scale to test the Biden administration? There's some argument that says the turnover of every single administration, whether, you know, some of it's South Korea, but also the United States, they've done something provocative. You know, they did it when during the year that Trump came into power, you know, when Obama came in, you know, a lot of people, and it seems to be somewhat of the conventional thought that, you know, we can expect something, that it's going to happen. So, you know, why don't we start? Bob, tell me what you think. Take either question. You know, North Korea interprets what we're doing and, you know, what they may be doing. And then Sarah, I'll go to you and then we'll open it up. Okay, Bob?
Now, they have closed the curtains on their public manifestations of their policy, thinking, discussions, everything. They just don't comment in the newspaper anymore. There are no foreign ministry spokesman statements. There's nothing. So we have no idea. I think the idea that they will necessarily do something provocative is malarkey. I don't think they have a necessity to do it if they don't want to. I don't know where they are in terms of their technical development of certain systems. If their engineers say that it's time for that, they have to test, then they might very well test. So I can't see the efficacy of guessing on this sort of thing at this point.
Okay, Sarah?
I think we mentioned the comment that I think, Philip, you mentioned that, no matter who's in Washington, the hostile policy remains. I think there's, pragmatic side that North Korea has seen administrations come and go. They usually try to position themselves to be able to set, I think, and part of what I think this 8th Party Congress was setting a plan for how to reset U.S.-North Korean relations. As to what, I think, as to whether they're going to do something brazen in the coming months to try to get the Biden administration's attention early on, it's always a possibility. They certainly listed off a long laundry list of military developments that they're hoping to, that they, at least aspirationally hope to achieve. I think that list looks very impractical given the state, the state of the country at this point. But, North Korea has always found a way to be surprising and do things that are unexpected or exceed expectations of what we think they would otherwise be capable of doing. I think that Kim has a lot of interest. I'm not an economist, but I definitely know that the situation in North Korea is dire, and he's got to figure out some way to try to bolster that second pillar of his legitimacy. And so it's interesting that the big takeaway of where the economy is headed is kind of a continuance of previous strategy. So we'll just kind of have to see how North Korea plans to position. I think some of the promotions over the course, not just at the 8th Party Congress, but over the course of the last year, certainly signaled that they're going to trend towards a more hardline policy, particularly with the elevation of Ri Sang-won, who we know has has a history and relationship with Kim Jong-chol, two probably notable hardliners. Both of them saw either their positions kind of reinforced or slightly elevated as a result of this party Congress. And there are a couple of others that we could talk about. There definitely seems to be setting the pieces on the chessboard, as so to speak, to use a sort of cliche analogy.
Okay, so why don't we open up to the audience? Rather than me reading them, I think it would be nice to hear actually some folks who are willing for them to give questions to both Sarah and Bob directly. So I'm gonna, just to give you a heads up, Eunjung Cho, you had a question for both Bob and for Sarah about his speech. And so would you be willing to go? Yeah, great, you're on air.
Thank you for the great discussion. Eunjung Cho with the Voice of America. Mr. Carlin, you said your key takeaway from the Party Congress was that North Korea was continuing economic reforms. I wanted to hear in more detail where you got this conclusion from. Did you see any signs and indication from Party Congress that North Korea is continuing reforms? You did mention about North Korean journals, but specifically from the Party Congress, because we didn't hear any words like our style economic management plan, nor socialist corporate responsible management system, but rather we heard Kim Jong Un mentioning raising the functions of the state. So if you could tell us more about where did you see the reform coming, or is North Korea backtracking from the 7th Party Congress in terms of reforms, given the economic hardships? And for Ms. Vogler, what is Kim Jong Un's message to America from this Party Congress? Is he saying that he wants to return to negotiations? Thank you.
Okay, Bob.
Good, nice to hear a question that's really based on the analysis of things. I think that we saw bits and pieces in the work report. For example, the work report on the Congress still mentioned economic levers, which are reformist in nature. He talked about reinforcing the position of the cabinet over the economy. which was one of the early signs of reform type activity. Although the work report did not specifically mention SERMs, that came out in the SPA meeting very explicitly, and is pointed very much at the enterprise level. So I think that in what we didn't see, my guess is, what we didn't see in the gist of the report is more fully covered in the Congress as a whole. I'm willing to hold off and watch how things develop from this point. But my sense was that he has not backed away, and people are misinterpreting a little bit of the language that we did see.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very good one. What is Kim Jong Un's message to America? I think that there were definitely some indications that, while not pleased with the lack of progress over the course of the last couple of years, the door was certainly left open for negotiations. There was no definitive cutting off that there's absolutely no path forward for the two sides to re-engage. The preconditions discussion that's the perennial problem in terms of coming to the table. It'll be interesting to see what happens with this with the new administration and what their take on the preconditions for dialogue situation will be. But I think that there were definitely some menacing overtones, but I kind of took heart that, we weren't the sworn enemy or something a little bit more diabolical, with just the principal enemy of the North Koreans. It's kind of a strange difference, and maybe it's picking at threads, but I think that there's a lot to be said for there's a domestic aspect of needing to show toughness and resolve against the United States. That's something that North Korea always does. But the pieces of language that you can pull out in the way that I think that there's still definitely the message is clear that they're not looking to back down, or they're not going to make anything easy for us, but that there are openings that, should we choose to take advantage, there could be some sort of return to a dialogue.
Okay, thank you. So David Hawk, David, haven't been in contact with you for a while. You had a similar question that I had in my mind. So if you can, why don't you go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, Bob, how can other professional economists and serious Korea watchers look at the work product and conclude that it's state over economy and see no prospect of reform?
Well, I have to be polite. I just think that they're looking at the wrong things, and they don't have enough background in, for example, the ongoing deep discussion within North Korea on what does socialist management mean and how should it be effectively applied. In the work report of the Congress, they talk about the need to continue to explore new approaches and to get rid of the old work method. The old work method is a reference to what they used to do all the time, which is just pass down economic goals without reference to what was possible or what the local situation was. So I think that, in my mind, the language really does point to reform is such a funny word, and economists are very particular about it. So talk in terms about pragmatism. Look, the new 5-year plan has much lower goals, I think. It reflects the fact that Kim and his advisors, and we don't know who they are, but they must be pretty smart people, understand that if you're going to get things moving again, you have to have realistic goals that people can meet. You have to have good figures. You have to have targets that actually match inputs. So all those things, it seems to me, go into the idea that Kim is more pragmatic and understands that reform measures which give more responsibility to lower levels are more likely to work than simply state mandated instructions on what's to be done where and how.
Okay. Okay, we have Sig. Why don't you go ahead with your question, probably for Sarah, perhaps? Hey, you're on mute.
Yes, I can hear you. Can
Now
you
we can
hear?
hear you. Yep.
Oh, very good. So Philip, actually, I'd like to change my question after
Bait and switch. Okay, go ahead.
you made the comment about provocations. The initial question was just, I was going to ask both of your panelists
Yeah.
about whether there was any mention of or a citing of the technical leaders of the nuclear program or the missile program at the Party Congress. But the question I really want to ask the two of them, and also you, Philip, since you brought it about the potential of the North taking some sort of action, you know, what you would call a provocation. I agree with Bob. I don't call it provocation. I think these are things that are well planned on their side. But what I found as I look back over the history of their program, what mattered much more than the actual action, or let's say if you call it provocation, was how the US administration responded to that action. And so I'm curious as to how do you think the Biden administration would respond or should respond to a missile test or a nuclear test? That's the question.
Okay. Hey, Sarah, why don't you go ahead and take that one if you want?
Sure thing. So I can't really speculate too much about the current thinking of the Biden administration. Don't have, you know, vast amount of knowledge of where exactly they're planning, but I do know that once diplomacy started to stall, then they started to then the North Koreans sort of restarted their missile testing campaign with their short and their medium range missiles, and that seemed to be kind of a calibrated attempt to kind of push the envelope, signal displeasure without going all the way towards the other end of the spectrum, that a nuclear weapon or a missile test or a long range missile would portend. So I would be a bit surprised if that's something that they were to try to go to right off the bat. I kind of see perhaps, a restart of their shorter range capabilities, demonstrating some of the new weapons that they talked about. The UAV development program has gotten a lot of attention. Some of their not so much their strategic weapons, but some of these newer technologies that show progress on a military development front, but aren't all the way toward, wouldn't signify quite as dramatic of a departure away from diplomacy as a nuclear or missile test would, because I think that they generally understand that doing so would potentially force the U.S. administration away from the negotiating table. And then there's also the considerations they may have about how the Chinese government may react to such a dramatic again, provocation not being the right word, but action at this time.
So I'll exercise some prerogative of the chair. I'll let Bob off the hook on this one. Sig, you can talk to Bob directly. My quick answer to that is, to me, I think, Sig, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of probing will be going on. I think we should be doing a lot more probing as well to see what the reaction is. To me, though, that's the easy question. What's the administration going to do if North Korea does something provocative on the scale that you were talking about? That's an easy question in my mind. The more difficult one to me is, what are they going to do if they don't do anything, right? That creates a whole other set of variables that maybe no one's really thinking about. I hope they are, in very detailed terms. I mean, I think the game plan has already been created if provocation happens. Again, for me, the more difficult sort of scenario or alternative is if they don't do anything for a while, and there's still that steady pressure of them continuing to develop their missile capabilities. So Bob, one of the questions that have come through that I think is really, that jumped to me, I think Chris Lawson, which is under Madison, there's a question that you had about leverage, and then I would add another question that someone talked about from Helen Kalinda. You know, maybe you can ask both of those questions. So let's do this. Chris, why don't you ask your question, and then Kalinda, why don't you ask your question, and then, you know, our panelists can go at it, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Okay.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So my question is in regards to an argument that you heard over and over again shortly after Trump and his team sat down with Kim Jong Un. The United States had given up a massive symbolic piece of leverage that has always been incredibly important to the North Korean regime, the legitimacy that came with, you know, sitting down with the United States, or the United States being willing to sit down with it. And so I'm curious for both of your thoughts on whether or not that argument is kind of legitimate, or if it's you know, less important than was made the case.
Okay, and then Helena, can you ask your question really quickly?
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yep. We can
Okay,
hear you.
good. I was just interested as to whether or not you folks could elaborate or speculate on how the Singapore communique might serve as a basis for the relationship going forward.
Okay, Bob, why don't you take that one, and then Sarah, if you know, you can answer the other one, and you know, we're going to wrap up maybe about 30 seconds or so. The short answer.
Short answer. The Singapore communique lists 3 main agenda items. I think that's right, if I remember. And those, even though they're in the order and sort of in the language of what the North Koreans wanted, they're really very much what the United States aims for anyway. Singapore Declaration was just a starting point. It's just a foundation. We can work with that agenda, it seems to me, and break out those separate items for discussion at a lower level, and that's how we're going to make progress.
Okay, Sarah?
Again, the 30-second answer. I think that U.S. policy towards North Korea has always had to grapple with the concept of, you know, being resolute vis-a-vis the North Korean threat and rewarding, being perceived to reward bad behavior. That's a constant push-pull of this relationship. And I think at the time, being, you know, full disclosure, being someone who sees engagement with North Korea as one way, as a strategy that we hadn't even really tried up until the point of the Singapore summit. I think that there, if we take ourselves back to that period of time, there were, you know, the ICBM capability had at least been at least a prototype had been proven. North Korea was conducting a series of increasingly powerful nuclear tests that, you know, the Trump administration never claimed to be anything, and never claimed to be traditional, and was willing to give it a try. What I would hope to see if we do go back to any kind of engagement policy is that it's then backed up at the working level, that symmetry is not where it ends, that there's more work being done to actually have some practical implementation plan or policy for those kinds of loftier goals.
Okay, so I was told we need to wrap up by 3 o'clock. I'm going to go over maybe 1 minute, Keith, sorry. So last question, 15 seconds. One thing, Bob, you want people to leave with as their takeaway from this conversation?
Think of the Congress as a blueprint. Look at it carefully for what it might portend over several years. And we have to wait and see what's going to happen right in front of our noses for the next few weeks. But the Congress is not really the guide for that.
Okay, Sarah?
I don't presume to have a better wrap-up comment than that, but yes, the Congress is one. It's a large, but it's one indication of where North Korea's priorities are, and it's an important piece of the puzzle. But there are many other puzzle pieces that North Korea reveals to us at various times, and only when we are able to put together all the pieces is when we have kind of a good understanding of where this regime is going. So never get too narrowed into one aspect, but try to look at it, the big picture as a whole.
Okay. All right. So we've run out of time. Bob and Sarah, thank you so much for a great for your insights. Very, very helpful at this time as the new administration comes in. I'm sure there are going to be a lot more questions. More people are going to be contacting you. On behalf of the National Committee of North Korea and World Affairs here in San Francisco, thank you very much for joining us, all of you. Thank you for your questions. Again, thank you to Bob and Sarah. And I want to just a special call out to Esther M. and Dan Wirtz for their tremendous work in helping putting this all together. And Sarah and Bob, don't sign off. I think we'd like to follow up with you afterwards. So anyway, please stay safe, stay healthy. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, but it's a tough time right now. So please take extra care, and thank you for supporting all of us. Thank you.